Good people, I hope you're doing well. I'm personally excited. This is our first episode, and I'm looking forward to interesting conversations. And today, um, before we start it, this is the political. This is a political space where we'll be talking about everything and anything within the political space, social justice, and how they are affecting our day-to-day existence. Today we started on an interesting topic. Currently, Africa is running for quote unquote political seat, and that is the AU chairperson seat. And we have interesting candidates. If you are following, I know you have your preferred guy, you have your preferred person because of your own personal reasons. But that is not really what we are going to delve into. Our major question we are going to ask today, and I'm hoping my beautiful guest who is going to introduce himself, is going to expound, because I believe he has like all the knowledge. I'll be here learning about everything. So the question we are going to ask ourselves is if the AU seat itself is relevant, or we need to be doing something about it. So without much ado, let me welcome my first guest. I'm not going to introduce you, so you have to do your own introduction. Say everything you want. Beat your own drum. I believe in beating your drums. So, yeah.
Thank you, Sharon, for welcoming me to your show and for allowing me to come and have a discussion with you on the subject of African affairs. So, my name is Benigno Aquino. I'm an advocate of the High Court. Also having interest in the study of the institutions of the African Union.
Okay.
I love human rights and other related subjects in terms of the Africa we want. So a discussion like this, I'm very passionate about it.
Yes, so you're the right first host. I'm going to be jumpy in this episode because I'm excited. It's an interesting podcast and I'm looking forward to seeing what we build out of it. Let's just jump right into it. I know we have different perspectives, different opinions on Africa and how African is being run at an African level. And from my end, I believe like AU really should work. The problem is the people who are there. On your end, you feel like it's something different. So maybe you can start us from where Africa Union is and where you think it should be going.
Yes, when we look at African Union, there are strides that have been made beginning, I think, in 2002, when we transitioned from the Organization of African Union to African Union.
Yeah.
It was a good concept because the idea was to accelerate what they call, even though I disagree with it, but what they call it the Pan-Africanism. The solidarity, the
Afrocentricism.
Yes, those heavily loaded ideas.
Yeah.
So that was the idea. And so far they are making successes. I mean, they have come up with institutions to ensure that these ideas are taken to the next level. But I've looked at it and I question that if we needed to move so fast, I think a different path would have been taken. And that path, I think, if we can have a political integration of Africa so that it becomes a one political unit in the European sense or even the American sense, then I think we will have the audacity or even the power to leverage other powers so that Africa can stand. But as it stands now, I highly doubt the success of the policies they are put in place.
The policies, is it a policy problem or is it an implementation problem? And where does it come from? Is it the people? Because from my end, I subscribe to it. It's actually the people, it's not the policy, because I don't think the people who are coming up with policy at an African level are like dumb or unreasonable enough to come up with policies that are not effective. So is it a policy problem?
Actually, when you look at African Union and even another sister institution like the European Union, somebody will argue that African Union has more policies than even the European Union. But when you look in terms of GDP or even geostrategic strength, European Union is far ahead of Africa. Even in terms of trade, Africa interstate trade is only 15%. When you look at European Union, I think it is around 68%. You can see the disparity. So it is not per se the question of policy making, but implementation. Once we agree on a certain policy, the fundamental question that comes is who is going to implement it?
It's the who, not the how.
Yes, it is the who. Yeah. And that who, when you look at how the structures of AU, we have the Assembly of Heads of States, Assembly of Heads of State. Then below it is the Executive Council. Now, so Assembly of Heads of State can come up with the policy, but you realize this policy, and now it has to cascade back to the states for implementation. And these states, they may have different perception on how they look at these particular policies. So actually, it is my summary argument normally that African Union is the biggest obstacle to African progress.
As opposed to what? But even before you go to as opposed to what, when you're saying like it's the head of states who come up with these policies, but this is at a continental level, and then it has to be taken back to
the states.
Yeah, it has to be taken back to the states. I mean, you're the guys who implemented this. It's your head of states who implemented this. It's them who agreed onto that. So why are they having problems again coming back to their states to implement all those policies within their states? Because I believe once the resolutions have been made, it's implemented.
Let me give you a typical example, like in the case of Visa Free Africa. That is one of the flagship projects under the Agenda 2063. That by 2063, Africa should be visa free. So that if you want to travel to South Africa, you just have the passport, you get into a plane, and you go to South Africa. Now, when it comes to implementation, now you realize, for example, a country like Kenya has agreed that Kenya should be visa free. But Nigeria opposes this. Of course, there are some interstate, how can I call it, interstate skepticism in terms of how they view other countries. They see other countries as maybe instead of transporting human capital, they will be transporting crime or even maybe illicit goods. So that lack of common understanding of African affairs, it can only be overcome if we have a central authority for the African Union, which can now negotiate these disparities. The way the Confederation in America evolved into the federation that created the United States. So without that, I'm very skeptic about the progress of Africa.
So again, as opposed to what? Because if you're saying AU itself is like the whole obstacle to, Africa progressing towards where it's supposed to be heading right now, then what are you proposing to be in existence?
Yes, actually I've said it. My proposal would be, if we can do away with the African Union, or if we can reform it to a level where Africa does not have 55 countries, with different perception of either foreign policy or even economic development or even financial management. If we can have Africa as one country, in the sense of European state, or in the sense of the idea of the Chinese, or in the sense of the Federation of the United States. If we can have that idea, then what will happen would be Africa will have the authority to speak about its own resources vis-a-vis other states. But a lack of that, if you have 55 countries, I've been giving it this example. You have a president of the United States giving a press conference to the president of Somalia or prime minister of Ethiopia. You can see that disparity of power. But if we have a president of Africa giving a press conference with the president of the United States or even president of China, you can see that level of almost similarity or equanimity in terms of power. So if that happens, Africa will begin to speak about its resources. But as at now, implementation of these policies would be a daunting task.
Okay.
Yes.
And just maybe before I, just a follow-up question. Paint a picture of that Africa that has one government, one, yeah. Because I'm looking at number one. Africa has, historically, we are people who have been like subjected to things that we didn't have. Our kingdoms were split and we had like countries, different borders from what we were used to. Our culture, our language, those are things that were taken away from us, like forcefully. And then they were taken away from us forcefully. You look at like our culture, we argue that, our culture has been eroded by constant need of Africans being required to conform to like the global kind of a standard culture, which does not even exist. Because if you look at like America, Europe, China, and all that, these guys are having like their own different cultures, and they exist like they still globally exist. But then there's this Africa that, first of all, we had our kingdoms, you took them away, you brought states. Now you're taking away our states. You want to now put us in this one big Africa is a country, which already, I think there are many opponents of people who even get mad at people who think Africa is a country. And now you want to take away the borders that we really learned to love, and you want to put us in this one big giant thing from north to south under one leader.
I think there can be very, very many answers towards that. I always disagree with people who say that there are some things that the Europeans brought us. I mean, yes, to some extent, like Christianity, the European brought it to Africa.
Yeah,
it used
the
never to
English
be there.
language,
Yes. The English language,
socialism taken away and brought the individualism and all that.
But others we imported.
The list is long.
Yes, the list is long, including human rights. But others we imported ourselves because we reached a certain level in which we started viewing European or Western kind of lifestyle as superior to others. So it was important.
It was sold as superior.
Yes, but looking at Africa where it is and where it should be, I look at it this way, that yes, it is true when you say that initially we had kingdoms. Kingdoms did exist. But there's something that we must also know, that these kingdoms, they used not to interact because of communication and the transport disparity. So they couldn't interact. That applied even in Europe, or even continental America, or even in the Chinese tributary states. So here comes the press, the technology, and the industrialization. So whatever one can do, it was inevitable that these kingdoms would have to start communicating, and conflict will emerge. Now, with Africa, the whole idea of Africa was enough, would have been good to unite these kingdoms, or even these kings, towards the Africa they wanted. But then came the interruption of the colonialism that interrupted that. So that could not happen. Yes, which now turned African countries into a state in the sense of the European state, a state where states must now begin to pursue self-interest. So if that is the issue, that what defines the destiny of a country is how they look at themselves.
Within the confines of their borders.
Now, it simply means that a nation with power will have leverage over others. So when you look at Africa, if we combine them, all of them, according to AU policies and the data, they are saying if we combine all the GDP of African countries, it comes to $1.4 trillion. If you compare that with the current United States GDP, which is $27.8 trillion, you can see that disparity. It simply means that unification of Africa, in the sense of German unification, is the only way to go.
But comparing the GDPs, I think even if you combine like Africa's one and you want to put it like in the economic global space, we still don't have the bargaining power, just basically because of our GDP and everything. And I think when we were talking we were discussing about, first of all, you said AU itself is not even effective because
Yes.
we are
Actually, we
talking
should do away
about,
with it. Yes.
we should
Should do away
reserved
with it. Yes.
reservations
Yes.
reservations. We you're looking at it from the perspective of you said it's 60% donor dependent.
Exactly.
So
Yes.
it becomes hard for you to implement, your resolutions, your policies, and everything just based on donor fundings when you should be. And if we are talking about 60% donor funding, and now our GDP is like 6 trillion
Trillion.
globally. Now, will we even have will we still have that bargaining power?
Yeah. So I agree with you when you say that, according to you,
Will it make a difference?
African Union's data, Africa, like in 2022, they had a budget of only 650 million, of which 60% is donor funded.
Yeah.
Only 30% comes from the states.
Yeah.
The lesson you learn from that is that the budget that comes from the state is too minimal, and it is deliberate because they focus on the development of their respective countries.
instead
The
of-
net effect of that is that a Kenyan, as time is going, a Kenyan consolidates that idea of Kenyan. Uganda the same, Tanzania the same. So when it will reach a point that maybe something, a global affair a conflict may happen, that may induce us as Africans to start thinking of that immediate federation, it may be difficult because of that, those cultural integration and even nationality and even the whole idea of self-determination.
Yeah.
So the process must begin now towards abolition of AU and its structures so that we come up with a political integrated countries. So you talked about the 1.4 or 3 trillion that the combined GDP.
Against 27
Against
trillion
27.
in US, and if we'll still have like an almost level economic landscape globally.
That would be far better than a 2.4 trillion Kenyan shillings of Kenya.
Yeah.
Because we'll begin to talk about trillion US dollars GDP of Africa. So you have a lever, even if we are going to negotiate with the European Union, we negotiate as Africa, not as 55 countries taken on a plane to, let me say, in Paris to negotiate. And they negotiate differently from their whole idea of Africa that we want.
Okay.
Yes.
But what is that? What is that structure? Because you're talking about doing away with the structure. Maybe for someone who doesn't understand the structure of AU as
Yes.
it is, and maybe its shortcomings.
Yes.
Yeah, because I believe we have a reserved bank, but then if the reserved bank itself is not working, then is it the problem of the system? Is it a systematic problem, or is it like an individual? Because we are talking about states really working towards developing themselves within the confines of their borders and not like.
Yes. So African Union, of course, I have a problem with the structural how it is built, because we have the Assembly of Head of States, which is the key policy making organ of the African Union. Then below it we have the Executive Council, which consists of the ministers of foreign affairs of these 55 countries coming together, maybe in terms of looking at how the roadmap towards implementation of the policies emanating from the Assembly of Heads of States. But of course, we have the Pan-African Parliament, where each legislature within these 55 countries select members who become debaters or delegates in that particular African Parliament. And of course, we have financial institutions, which, for example, there's an idea of the African Investment Bank, African Central Bank, and the Monetary Bank. These are good ideas. They are good ideas. But in terms of how they are going to be implemented, some sort of power would be needed to negotiate on how, for example, if we have this idea of African Central Bank, how is it going to be saturated with the funds? Yes. We must have one currency. And Africa must have the ability to tax itself so that money is put into this bank. That is the only way If we can do that, I've been given an example. It's just an example. It's not a reality. That in one financial year, if we have Africa as a state, in one financial year, we can even collect $1 trillion US dollars. That is even closer enough for us even to build the highways across African capitals. And that will be a good starting point towards a future and more prosperous Africa. But as things stand now, I'm very
you want to do away with with Africa Union.
Yes.
Shamelessly. Maybe we can take a break, and then we'll come back with. We spoke about donors, and maybe we'll when we come back, maybe you'll have to respond
Africa is a donor-funded continent.
to the question of Africa being a donor-funded continent, while
And
it's also the richest country in terms of resources and all that. So maybe we can have that conversation.
The minerals which are going to shape the AI. Artificial intelligence acceleration. The minerals, they are residing here in DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo.
Let's hold our thoughts. Let's discuss it after the break.
Thank you.
Welcome back. So, where did we leave it? Africa being a donor-funded continent.
Yes.
And then we are here pushing for having a unified one voice when it comes to the economic landscape. What's your reaction?
Of course, Africa is a donor-funded continent in many areas, whether it is human rights, whether it is even some government projects, despite the very fact.
Even running the governments itself, running the AU itself, it's donor-funded.
Actually, as we saw and discussed before the break, we saw that 60% of AUC budget comes from donors, and only 30% come from the states. And that should tell us something. Either African countries, they are too poor, or they are just deliberate in terms of the budget they want to be taken to the African Union. So it's a reality. Africa is a donor-funded continent, and that also means that Africa is a poor country, is a poor continent, because it means we can't fund. I remember even recently the president of Kenya was saying that one of the policy that he came up with in terms of the resolution of conflict in Haiti, Africa Union did not even have funds to do that, or even funds even to support the prevention of conflict in Somalia. So they rely on donors, and if donors don't give the money, there's no money. So typically we can agree Africa is a donor-funded continent, which is so unfortunate, despite the fact that we have vast resources.
And now I'm thinking of it because you're looking at doing away with the whole AU and having another system. But don't you think we are still going to transfer, or the new system is still going to inherit all these donor-funded poverty and all that? Transferring it into the new system.
If we buy the idea that I had, that Africa needs to be a state with a monopoly of violence and a strong central authority in terms of presidency, if we go the American way, a strong legislature that can legislate on the affairs
strong
of Africa.
Level of poverty.
And even African judiciary, not the African court, but the African judiciary. In other words, I'm talking about Africa as a state in the European sense, with the central authority. If we can have that, the next thing that comes is it will have the power and authority to tax itself. So once it taxes itself, it means it will have the authority to give directions on how the resources of Africa will be managed.
Utilized.
So that instead of taking tea leaves and coffee seeds to European markets, we can do value addition here in Africa.
Then export it. But we can still do it with the AU as a system. So it's more of a people problem, the persons, governments, the people in the government, kind of a problem. Because looking at poverty as poverty, I feel like it's is it an economic model of Africa? Because donor funds is a source of income.
Yes.
Donor funds is a source of income. So if you're looking at poverty, selling
Yes.
poverty as a whole economic model to raise funds to run your continent or to run all the states within the continent, then it is deliberate. It is quite deliberate.
Remember African Union, even if we look at it in terms of the Organization of African Union, the forerunner to the African Union. It is just the same organization, of course. There's only a difference in terms of the institutional reforms that were done through the Constitutive Act. But the whole idea of the African Union still remain beginning from its inception in 1962, I think 1963.
Yeah.
And close to now a century, the problems, the African problem, whether it is disease, whether it is poverty, whether it is underdevelopment,
Has
whether
remained
it is
constant.
massive unemployment, they remain constant.
Yeah.
Now, when you compare Africa, the level Africa was in 1963, and the level that China was in 1963, they were almost at the same level. Underdevelopment, poverty, disease, and all the sorts.
Yeah.
But what the fundamental question would be, what did China do that we didn't do?
Yeah.
Yes. It simply means that their leaders studied the context in which they were operating.
So
And
it's a
there is
leadership problem, not
Of course, there's also a leadership issue. Of course, I agree with you. There's also a leadership issue. But they saw that, yes, they could open up the Chinese market to foreign investments. So what they do, when the investors were coming, they already found the Chinese had already trained the workforce and the human capital. So they were able to leapfrog and leap from poverty-stricken country to a first-class country. And that can only happen if the vast resources, vast human capital that you have in Africa can be centrally managed. I'm not talking about, let me put this right, I'm not talking about central management in the communistic sense. No. I'm talking about a state, having the whole idea of a state that can centrally direct the affairs and the destiny of a country.
Direction.
Yes, like the America did, like the Germany did.
Okay.
Yes.
Speaking of donors, maybe talking about Africa without talking about poverty.
Yes, poverty is associated.
Yeah, and I still feel like the whole poverty thing. It's a working economic model for Africa. Both ways, the people who are investing in terms of donors, because again, if you look at donor, the whole donor thing, it's like a whole economic model, because I think you give donor money to where you have interests, where you have resources. When you're talking about funding peace, when you're talking about funding war to some extent, when you're talking about giving medical aid and everything, you automatically somehow have an interest. And the long discussion has been that, we are getting all these donors because donor funds because, people, the external factors, but then we don't look at ourselves as Africans, and because we are not looking at ourselves on the mirror to say, when you're an African and let's say you meet a potential donor, what are you telling them? First thing, you have like 30,000 poor women somewhere, which actually is true. They're actually poor women, but then we don't do much to help these women. Because the constant state of their poverty is actually the economic model that I was telling you about. So we are looking at we talked about Vision 2030 Vision Agenda 2063 of Camera, and one of the pillars there is on poverty eradication.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Yes. And actually, it is not that African head of states, when they sit in the assembly of head of states as a structure of the African Union, that they are not aware. That's exactly what informed the Agenda 2063, when they put the flagship projects there and aimed with the vision of a prosperous Africa. And one of them we discussed before break was the African Continental Free Trade.
Yeah, the free trade.
Yes, because if Africa can begin to trade with itself, it can spur growth. Because a market of 1.3 billion people is not a small market. It's a market bigger than some regions combined.
And the analogy of Safaricom having...
Yes. Yeah. So when you look at even I gave an example previously about the AGOA vis-a-vis Africa, how African goods can access the United States market, the conditions that are under AGOA. If Africa speaks in terms of one state, voice, there will be no negotiation between foreign powers in 54 countries. Africa will only have one embassy in all these capitals. And that will act as a leverage for Africa in terms of its own intertrade, and that this will give value addition to some of the goods that they produce. Even an example of a visa-free Africa. I mean, it's a good example, but simply because African countries and their heads of states, the way they view their own domestic structures and the structures of the AU are completely different. That's why you may find a country like Nigeria is not supporting visa-free Africa, but a small country may support it because of how they view it. So, but if we have a central authority, Africa as a state, all these things will be managed by let me say the presidency, if that is what we adopt. But as things stand now, we are going to have a very, very big challenge in terms of poverty alleviation in Africa.
But now I'm thinking, because when you're talking about Africa having like the centralized way of, utilizing its resources and all that, I'm looking at let's say already we are preaching poverty.
Yes.
Poverty is constant.
Yeah.
Poverty is constant in every African state. So far we are looking at how to sustain, if Kenya has like 55, 56, 54 million people, and the government wants to ensure that all these limited resources are able to sustain its 54 million, but then let's say another African country is not able to sustain itself with whatever resources they have. Look at even the debts they have within their countries and all that. So again, as a Kenyan or as a Kenyan government, am I going to be quite open to having to share the little that I have with another African country, just because we are pushing towards a unified, centralized kind of a government? Because now that is an internal, an unavoidable internal, within Africa, kind of a conflict that we might have to.
Let me give an example, because it's a concept that Africa is looking at, but it can only learn sometimes, of course, from the history of other countries. The question you are raising, America faced it at the beginning of its founding. We had different small states. I think there were around 13. And they looked at these confederates vis-a-vis interference from foreign powers. And they came to one conclusion that one state could not match the power of the United Kingdom, or even France, or even Portugal. So the only solution was these confederates, they had to evolve into a federation with a central authority handed in the presidency of the United States, there's the legislature, and of course there's the judiciary. So with that, America began to tax itself. And that is how growth was spurred. By the time we were entering the 20th century, America was the most powerful state.
In other words, that's a conflict we'll have to face eventually, but then we look beyond the conflict to the kind of, we just look beyond the conflict.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, if we want to have a Africa that can speak, let me say in the 22nd century, because 21st century has gone, let me say, East Asia, perhaps maybe China may take it, or America can retain it. So that's gone. If maybe 22nd century Africa wants to have a voice on global affairs, the only path towards that is unification. The way in the 19th century, Germany asked itself that question. that what can it do to contain French dominance in Central Europe? The only path was German unification. But it's quite ironical that the only person who understood this was one person, and that was Bismarck. And once he succeeded in doing that, Germany became so powerful than its neighbors combined. And the result was 2 world wars. So I'm trying to imagine if that is the path Africa, of course it will be a very delicate path, but if Africa can take it, by the time we will be done with the unification, I think one head of state will say what Benjamin Disraeli said about German unification, that something has happened, a tectonic plate has happened in the world that no one will be in a position to contain. That will be the African power.
Yeah.
But as at now, with these 55 countries, smaller the way they are, smaller GDP, conflict here and there, I don't see any solution unless we take the path towards unification.
Okay. Okay. Speaking about that radical kind of change.
Yes.
My main problem, and I think it's not even a problem, it's a fear. Do you think African leaders as we have, people say Gaddafi, who is this guy, this other guy who was killed. Okay, let's talk of Gaddafi. People say he's the one who could have taken Africa to that direction that maybe you are talking about, but then his time came to an end before he was able to even start the conversations, or if he started maybe before he could sell the idea to many people. But then looking at 2024, 2025, 26, so going forward, do you think the leaders we have are able to manage this kind of power? Because again, it's coming with some level of power. And looking at African governments as they are just managing 55 million people and a budget of just 55 million people. It's quite something. Now imagine giving them like a population of 1.4 billion, 54 states. That is one thing, and you're giving them like this level of bargaining power, and you're giving them these people to lead. Are they ready to handle that kind of a power?
I don't see the unification of Africa happening in the lifetime of the current heads of states and governments of Africa. It may not happen, but there's something you said about Gaddafi. Gaddafi had the idea of a unified Africa, the central authority. Even Museveni has been speaking about it, that if Africa has to have an important geostrategic security, then unification is the way forward. But you realize that they are just speeches. They cannot translate them into action. For one simple reason. When leaders or statesmen gather, there's one fundamental fact about them that can make them influence policies, and that is power. So Museveni, with the GDP of Uganda, it cannot effect any meaningful change in Africa. The same with Gaddafi. The way he ended simply means that he did not speak with authority in terms of the power that he had from his country that could effect changes. And when you look at African countries, their GDP are more or less the same. So that means there's no single African country that can wake up one day the way Prussia woke up one day and unified Germany behind it. That may be impossible. So it will require, I normally argue that if we can have a unified Africa, we may go the African way, the American way. For example, by requesting for a referendum, that which countries, we can have a pathway for a referendum, saying that how many countries would want to be under one state called maybe Africa. Yes. So if we do that, if majority would have succeeded to become one Africa, others, by the very fact that there will be small countries, with the time, they will join. They will have to join the way it happened in America. And that is the only way, the only pathway towards a strong Africa that can have a voice in global affairs. Yes, and that will even lead to poverty eradication. This important Vision 2063 will be easily implemented. We'll have only one currency, one Air Africa that is crisscrossing the skies,
One reserve bank.
one navy, one reserve bank,
Tax
one
system.
army. Yes.
Yeah.
Even when you look at the African standing defense that was created in 2003, it's meaningless. We still see,
There's no
can't do
donor
anything.
funding. We are selling. Actually,
still
it
rely on
could
donor
work.
funding.
It could work. Only that it's been sold as a system that is there that could really work if we could get foreign
So
donor
all
funding.
these are good ideas, but in terms of implementation, the heads of an assembly of states sitting at the Assembly of the African Union, they are powerless. They are powerless to implement all this. They are good ideas, but they can't implement them because there's no power to do so. There's the will, but there's no power. We have learned this from history, especially the history of the United States in its founding. Yes.
Even on its regional mechanisms, because again, it has to trickle down. And I think you've mentioned Magufuli, and when you're talking about him pushing for like a unified Africa,
Yes.
but then if we are starting, we start it like baby steps. I'm looking at it, his voice within the region, ESC, East Africa. It's quite not really, I don't know if it's vocal enough to unify the East Africa, Eastern Africa, and all that. But then this is someone who is looking at a vision of having Africa as a united,
Yes.
as a united front.
Actually, if you ask all these heads of state in Africa,
Yeah.
and you
They all
bring
see it as a possibility.
and you ask them if they are for the idea of a federated Africa, they will tell you yes, that we are for it. Even in East Africa, this idea of East African community becoming a federation, all heads of states have agreed to it. So the fundamental question is, what is preventing it? There must be some institutions, like for me, I believe African Union is the biggest obstacle to a federated Africa. Yes.
And what's the obstacle in ESC and East Africa and SADC?
And of course, another one which may apply even to these regional mechanisms like East African community is the perception that these regions have developed about themselves. Since now it's close to a century, and these distinct states, they have developed their idea that we are more Kenyan. Yes, we are Tanzanian.
We are Tanzanian.
We are Ghanaians.
Which,
we are Nigerians.
Rightly
Now,
so, rightfully so.
That sort of nationalism will prevent, actually it will postpone the idea of a federated Africa into the future. So, in as much as, of course, I concede, in as much as I would want that this should happen now, because there's no wasting of time. When you look at the previous we were discussing, when you look at the areas that are going to influence progress for mankind in the future, we talk about artificial intelligence. And America, China, and other states already have put structures in place to make sure that they leapfrog into the next frontier. Africa, when you look at ourselves, even in terms of industrialization, we have never reached that stage. So by the time we will consider industry as the most important thing, we reach there, other countries will
be
far
talking
ahead of us.
radical AI,
Yes.
and maybe the next thing after AI.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it is my opinion that there's no time to wait. A federated Africa is a concept that must be actualized now if we are to catch up with other powers. Yes. Because we see when you go to South China Sea, you see China has begun to challenge America simply because it has become economically powerful. That's why it wants to assert its authority in the South China Sea. Russia is doing it in Eastern Europe. Africa, we have nothing to
Everyone
to
is scrambling, and I believe it will get to a point where now it is. Right now, it's quite subtle that everyone is looking for a stake or a say somewhere in some corners of Africa, but then we are getting to a point where it will be quite vocal, like who is marking what territory, where and why, and it might be like the whole continent. Like if it's Chinese influence, it's like the whole Africa. If it's European, it's the whole Africa. As we come to the end, because this is a conversation that is not going to end today.
Yes.
We can't go without talking about the AU, the current political climate within the AU, and we are looking at the chairpersons and their quest for the seats. Maybe just paint a picture of the climate as it is. Do you think the parties are selling? Are they selling something worthy of following, especially as an ordinary citizen? Because it's an interest of states, but then states are brought into place by individual people. So what interest do they have, and are these candidates really representing like the individual interests of people?
Yes, I watched their debate, and of course all of them have what it takes to lead the secretariat, a body that for me I consider a very useless body, of course.
Wow.
But to say something is that leaders cannot be judged before they reach the office. Because however much they are learned, however much experience they have, it is the events which are unique, which will impose decisions sometimes on them. So it will depend on how they act on those events. So until they assume office, our judgment may be very scanty. But be that as it may, it is not difficult to see that the Agenda 2063 will influence their action points and how they lead the secretariat towards the vision of the Agenda 2063. And we can also look into the past and ask, why since 2015, what progress have we made in terms of this Agenda 2063? Of course, there are some slight projects in terms of putting in place roadmaps for the implementation.
Yeah.
So, in terms of candidates, I would say let's wait. Yes, office, upon assumption of office.
Why is that a safe answer?
We can begin to judge them.
Why is that a safe answer? Because at the end of the day, people they have sold their manifestos.
Yes.
You have to go to a state. Tell bargain. You have to bargain for the power you want, and while you're bargaining, you have to tell the people what you are bringing to them. And while it's easy to sell it to the states, it's quite hard for individual people to buy into what you are doing. And let's say, just for example, there's this South African journalist who was asking if one of the candidates, okay, it's obvious, but without mentioning countries or names, one of the candidates is being asked like, how are you going to defend or protect Africa to a certain extent when you're given this seat as a AU chairperson, when your own country, your own backyard is going through some serious problems that needs to be addressed, but then your voice is quite silent on the issue. So maybe, and now that is an individual problem. It's not a state problem.
State problem, of course. Yes, I saw the question, and I think that question was not thoughtful enough, because the question did not understand the role of AUC chairperson. Because AU chairperson is the head of the secretariat. In other words, he is not the policy
implementer,
the policy formulator. He's not
formulator.
Yes, he only implements the policies that are generated by the assembly.
But already the existing policies on let's say issues about war, we have declarations.
Yes.
There are policies around human rights, and we are having human rights violations. So And these are things that are actually affecting people in their own individual capacity.
Yes.
So if you're not able to address the same, if you're not able to address the same as a within your backyard, then how do we trust you that you're able to? Because it's their regional mechanisms, the human rights courts, the all that. So if you're not able to address it within your
Okay, I may not speak for the person who was asked, but
Yeah.
it just goes without saying that the person who was asked
yeah,
does not hold any political public office back from his country.
true.
So,
But doesn't
however
prevent
much,
them from
I
speaking.
don't speak for him, but however much he may want things to be good or even bad, he doesn't
Yeah.
have the wherewithal to do that. He does not hold instruments of the state.
Yeah.
But be that as it may,
Yeah,
when I look at these candidates, the way I say that maybe my judgment will be formed when they begin, when they assume office, there are things I would want them to do. The person who will take the office.
yeah,
Any person, whether it is Raila or even Mahmoud Ali, because they are the serious contenders, any person who would see that serious reforms need to be done,
yeah,
especially in terms of policy implementation of the African Union, anyone who would see that and pick it and run away with it, I think he would be at a position to solve some of the problems that we face in terms of policy implementation. Let me give you another example. Even when it comes to human rights issues, some people have argued that we no longer need resolutions, treaties, or even conventions,
exactly.
or even declarations.
Yeah.
They are enough. That what we need
The
is
implementation.
implementation.
Yeah.
And that is exactly what applies even to the whole structure of the African Union. We have the policies there, the Agenda 2063 and others. The only thing that is lacking is power to do
implement
the
them.
implementation.
And
which
I'm looking
is-
at implementation.
Which states can't do, if I may interrupt.
Yes,
they
sorry.
can't do simply for one reason. Number one is
The resources.
the domestic structures of these countries and how they perceive
Yeah.
international relations, because Africa, they view Africa in terms of, they look at it as another country. And number two is that particular, the resources, even to act on them. And number three is their priorities. If you come to Kenya, for example, priority may not even be about visa, just as an example.
Yeah.
If you go to Somalia, their priority may be even conflict resolution,
Yeah.
like even in South Sudan.
Yeah.
And South Africa, it may be about inflation.
Yeah.
Or even-
Creating job markets.
Yes,
Yeah.
opening their country for job market. So these disparities and conflict in terms of perception of the priorities of these respective countries
Quite different.
definitely
Yeah.
influences policy implementation at the African Union. Yes, which is a very, very big problem. That's why, for my idea, would be African Union with its institutions, especially the AUC, is the biggest obstacle towards a federated,
Not the states.
federated Africa. If you
Not
do
the
away with it-
individual persons.
Of course, there's also leadership, which we can discuss in another forum.
Yeah.
But if I can just give an example. In 1860, when Germany was still divided, many of the leaders then believed that German security depended on Austria. But there's only one person who believed that German problems come as a result of Austria, and therefore Austria must be expelled to cease from becoming a security guarantor of Germany. He was in the minority. Actually, at some point when he was speaking the Reichstag, it was shut down. But when he became foreign minister for Prussia, and he succeeded in expelling Austria and uniting German confederates behind Prussia, the way I said, Germany became more powerful than its neighbors combined. That is what we need. We need that federation in Africa. It's the only way. Before that, it will just be conversation, formulation of ideas, which end in papers, no one to implement. And I don't think as African citizens, we have the luxury of wasting time on policy formulation when we know we can't implement them.
Yeah, true. I agree. We have
So
enough
any candidate
policy.
who, upon assuming office,
Yeah.
would see that, I
Yeah.
think, for me, will have my support. Yes.
Okay. Safe but justified. I'd like to bring it to a close at this
Okay.
particular point. I think it's a conversation that needs follow up, especially
Yes.
post having the new AU chairperson. Yeah, to just follow up the expectations, the deliverables, and maybe how we can have how we can have everything, how the presence of Africa Union as it is without, having to change the whole structure, how it can be felt by, ordinary individual citizens at the ground level, because I think that is again something that is lacking. We have made this AU something that is quite abstract. It only ends at the state level. But then when you look at it, poverty affects people at the ground level. It doesn't affect countries. When you talk about human rights violations, it's actually
Yes.
human beings who are being kidnapped, and not, certain governments or certain heads of state somewhere. So the presence really has to be felt at the individual level, and
But
that is something that we should
there's an idea
follow
of
up.
the silencing of the guns,
Yeah.
which prevention of conflicts and making sure
But
that the
is it
security.
being felt at the
It is
individual
not being felt.
level? That
It
is
is
that
not being
is that
felt.
is my problem.
And the reason is what I was giving you. Yes, it is not being felt. All these flagship projects within the
Yeah,
Agenda
not
63,
not
they are all
completely
there. They
not
are
being
good
felt.
things. The
True,
African free trade, I mean, the
true.
cyber security,
Yeah,
even the e-education,
yeah.
where all African citizens will be accessing the same university
The same
in terms of
university and quality of
training
education.
the human capital. This is what the
Yeah,
Chinese did. These are good ideas, but
but
this
then because
resources to do
you
them
cannot
are
you
also
cannot
there.
you cannot educate a paper, you cannot educate a
Yes.
policy, you cannot educate a government. At the end of the day, it has to end by impact being felt at an individual level, and I think that is something that people heavily forget. So thank you so much.
Yes.
Maybe if you have like a parting shot before we close.
A parting shot. I think you have said everything, but my parting shot would be
Yeah.
in forums or even in conversations like this, a serious conversation should begin to be undertaken as to the competence and especially competence of African Union to ensure that 30 million or even 40 million, even 100 million people are lifted out of poverty.
True.
Yes, once we begin that conversation, it is inevitable that this whole structure of the African Union has to be reformed because currently, as I
As you
said,
said,
it is the biggest
it has
obstacle
failed.
to the progress of Africa.
Wow, I'm not going to add anything. Thank you for coming to our podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you for your contribution. I think we have done justice to the topic. Anybody would like to contribute to the conversation? Maybe we'll just start with our media platforms, and we will have them maybe listed somewhere on our channels, and yeah, we're looking forward to engaging. Sharon Owino, sorry I didn't introduce myself. Yeah, and I'll be hosting the Political. So I'm looking forward to hosting many people. I'm looking forward to a lot of radical conversations, a lot of bold conversations, and a lot of informations and learnings. Thank you and bye. Yeah.